Last week, Elon Musk said that any parent or doctor who sterilizes a child should get prison for life. And now in a new thread, he is doubling down, once again saying, I repeat my statement that any parents or doctors who do this should go to prison for life. And there's a long thread breaking down a lot of information having to do with an 18-year-old boy who died when undergoing, let's just say, gender-affirming care, as the left likes to explain it. And in this thread, we get something interesting. In a conversation between Zuby, Billboard Chris, Elon Musk, and others, there is a debate from the left and the right, but most importantly, data suggesting that this quote-unquote gender-affirming care is not actually helping these young people and actually may be hurting them. But as the story begins, we must talk about the tragedy of what we just saw from the post-millennial yesterday. And I think this story is important context to understand Elon Musk's point and data presented by Billboard Chris and others. Now, for those that don't know the context, Billboard Chris is an activist. We've had him on the show. He says that children cannot consent to these procedures, and I would agree with him. He is presenting data to Elon Musk and others showing that actually this care isn't helping anybody. Let me read for you the story from the post-millennial, and then we'll break down the argument that ensued on Twitter between Elon Musk and some leftists. The post-millennial reports, trans teen died from vaginoplasty complications during landmark Dutch study used to justify child sex changes. Major complications began within just 24 hours of the surgery. A 2016 medical article documenting the tragic death of one of the participants in the linchpin Dutch study, upon which the entire child sex change practice is based, indicates that puberty suppression was to blame for the young person's death. The case is that of an 18-year-old trans-identified male whose puberty was blocked by the Dutch researchers at a very early stage, meaning there wasn't enough tissue for surgeons to create a quote-unquote neovagina. Therefore, a more risky procedure using a section of the patient's bowel was necessary, which resulted in fatal necrotizing fasciitis. Whew, that's flesh-eating bacteria. The manuscript by Negenborn et al. Begins by saying that the absence of a functional vagina has a negative effect on the sexual quality of life of women. They just say outright women. And explains that multiple surgical procedures have been described for reconstruction in these patients. The patient is described as being a healthy 18-year-old for whom standard vaginoplasty surgery was not feasible due to having undeveloped genitals as a result of early puberty suppression. Transgender women with early onset gender dysphoria treated with puberty suppressing hormones report fewer behavioral and emotional problems and an improvement of general functioning. Readers are assured at this point. Major complications began within 24 hours of surgery, and necrotizing fasciitis was confirmed in the days that followed. Despite large doses of intravenous antibiotics and repeated surgical debridement, the previously healthy patient went into multiple organ failure and died. Once again, after this harrowing account of a young person's needless death, the researchers assure the reader that vaginal reconstruction has a positive influence on the quality of life of non-transgender and transgender women, but cautions that physicians and patients need to be aware of serious complications that may arise. The investigation into the young person's death revealed that the deadly strain of E. coli most likely came from the patient's own intestines, not from the hospital setting, meaning that the more risky surgery necessary due to the early puberty suppression almost certainly caused the fatality. I suppose the argument here is if the individual were an adult and had natural development, they would be able to better perform these surgeries. And the question then arises, are puberty blockers the appropriate response for children? I'm going to come out and say it. The left has been screaming about what they refer to as transgenocide. We have this story from Montana. Let me show you the headline here from the Daily Mail. Montana trans lawmaker is silenced again as she tries to speak after telling Republican colleagues they will have blood on their hands if they ban sex change surgery for kids. 7 supporters are arrested in the clash. Allow me to step back for a moment and just point this out. I presented to you just a moment ago the story of a teenager who died. Is the blood on the hands of this lawmaker? I think it's inappropriate to accuse anybody of having blood on their hands when we're trying to deal with a complicated medical issue. I think, everyone's going to try and do it. The fact remains that this individual was healthy and now is no longer living. I'm going to come out and say it. They call it transgenocide. But genocide is the removal of genetics, the genes of an individual from the gene pool. It refers to wiping out a group of people. It's come to mean something a bit larger than just like gene removal. And so I would argue this. The point was made by Seamus Coughlin that the left likes to project what they do onto what you say. To put it simply, if you have children or adults who are suffering from gender dysphoria, that is, they are trans identifying, and you sterilize, castrate, or otherwise remove their ability to reproduce, that's literally genocide. And I've wondered about this when it comes to the trans movement, because many of these people are autistic. It seems very much like eugenics. Individuals who have trouble socializing and fitting in are being convinced by doctors to remove their ability to reproduce. Seems rather fascistic, if you were to ask me. But that's just me. Well, here's the latest story. In a tweet from Billboard Chris about this story, Zuby responds saying, horrifying. People in the West really need to pause and consider WTF they are doing and supporting with this. The reality is so vile that even advocates rely purely on euphemisms and fluffy language to get around it. Ain't that the truth? Gender affirming care, they say. Just say child sex change. Here's what's fascinating about the whole debate. The right says genital mutilation. The left says gender affirming care. I don't care for either of these terms, but I certainly understand the point being made by both. I just say child sex change because that's literally what it is. It's weird, isn't it? You can't even call it that. YouTube gets mad. I call it what it is. Now, I'm certain many people on the right are going to say, no, it is genital mutilation, that they will assert that it is. Yeah. I understand what you're saying. The reason why I don't use that terminology is mutilation typically refers to So when we're talking about female circumcision and things like that, it is to remove a woman's ability. It is a female's ability to sense things, to feel certain, to damage the nerves, etc. The purpose of it is specifically to restrict something in that female. And I certainly understand the argument being made by the right in this circumstance. But I just think the politically neutral term, child sex change, proves a point better than saying mutilation. Mutilation doesn't get a point across to moderates, to leftists, to people who are uninitiated. What they just hear is the right is being sensational or hyperbolic. But saying child sex change offends the left. Why, though? That's literally what it is. That's what they're doing. What's wrong with just saying the name of the thing? That proves the point, in my opinion. Zuby points out they have to use euphemisms and fluffy language to get around it. I'll just call it what it is. And that shows how offended they get by what they're doing. Zuby goes on to say that first sentence just shouldn't be a thing in any type of sane society. This is Frankenstein level stuff. It's grotesque. Intellectuals can rationalize anything. But there is also wisdom in disgust and natural revulsion. Elon Musk says, I agree, this is super messed up. Mature, consenting adults should do as they wish, so long as they do not harm anyone else. But this child was too young for any kind of consent. They didn't know. The child had no idea what any of this meant. How could they even know what it is to be a man or woman, having not been either? That's the fascinating thing to me about the entire trans debate. They say that a child knows if they're a boy or a girl. How? I mean, just genuinely, how? To be a man, to know that something isn't right. To be a woman, to know that something isn't right. You have to be a woman or be a man. It's fascinating that there are individuals who've not been either who wish they were. There are individuals who have not been women who wish they were. It was, I think it might have been Michael Knowles or Matt Walsh, maybe. They're both. I think it was actually Matt Walsh asking a trans woman how they knew they were a woman. The individual, of course, did not have a real answer. And it's the most infuriating thing. They said that they had listened to a podcast, and on the podcast, they heard a trans person describe their experience. And Matt Walsh correctly then said, but that's not a woman's experience. That's a trans woman's experience. How do you know you're a woman? That's what I find fascinating. The individual did not ask females about their experience, their lives, and didn't relate to them. The individual related to a transgender person, which says more that it's probably something else. The sad reality was the individual said that they thought they were trans because they didn't fit in and they didn't like compliments on being masculine, which makes no sense. They said something like when people said, you're a shining example of masculinity or whatever. And it's like, no one's ever said that to me. And maybe it's because I'm not a shining example of masculinity, but I've never had any kind of compliment directed towards me as a person interpreted in any kind of way towards gender. You're very assertive. You're very confident. You're a little too arrogant. I mean, those are male things. Don't know, don't care. Maybe the real experience is that they're heavily socially influenceable. You see what I'm saying? Women are more likely to be collectivist. Men are more likely to be individualist. So maybe the issue outright was this individual felt like a woman because they were more attuned to social pressures than men typically are. That actually makes sense to me. But just because a man is more effeminate doesn't mean we should castrate or sterilize them, which seems to be what's happening. Brian Krasenstein issued a response. He said, I completely understand the argument. With that said, isn't an 18-year-old a consenting adult? I think the whole trans debate gets blown out of proportion by both sides. Democrats merely believe that parents, along with doctors and psychologists, should have the right to decide what's best for these often depressed, sometimes suicidal, mid-late teens, rather than the federal or state government. Every case is different, and every teenager is different. Research has shown that providing puberty blockers to those over a certain age, usually reversible, he says, can have significant impact on depression and suicide rates. Hormone treatment and puberty blockers can actually save lives. I understand that those away from the issue believe some of the more extreme incidents represent the norm. But that's not the case. I would rather listen to some of the best psychologists and doctors out there if it was my kid, rather than a politician who is politicizing it for their own gain. Now, people are disputing this point about reversibility. In fact, I think it is Lupron, I could be wrong, it says outright that it may result in permanent loss of the ability to reproduce. I could be wrong. But I think it does say directly that it'll affect this. And they give warnings to individuals who are going to take cross-sex hormones that you should take actions to preserve your either eggs or sperm, because it could be the end for you once you do this. Elon Musk responds to Krasenstein saying, what research? Every child goes through an identity crisis, but leaping to a permanent solution that sterilizes them for life before they could possibly consent for themselves is wrong, plain and simple. Brian Krasenstein says, I don't completely disagree. I'm almost entirely against sex transition surgeries or sterilization in anyone under 18. Here is one of the reports I am referring to regarding depression and suicide rates among transgender teens. He goes on to say, additionally, I would hope that parents, who almost certainly have the interest of child at heart, more so than random politicians do, would make the correct decision after speaking to experts. I'm merely saying that as a parent, I'd want every option open and that no two cases are the same. Puberty blockers don't sterilize children. Wrong. That is incorrect. Hormone therapy in some cases can cause some males transitioning to female become sterile. Yes. But male to female transitions are very unlikely to impact fertility. Completely wrong and evil, outright evil. Male to female transition includes the removal of the gonads and the ability to reproduce. You can argue that some transitioning doesn't, but much of it does. Healthcare providers can usually recommend a course of action that doesn't result in sterilization of a teenager. The government should not interfere with decisions that parents should be able to make along with experts regarding the best possible solutions for their children. One or two horrible cases does not represent what's actually going on here. In response, we do have this from Carolyn, who says, the study only shows people a year out. It's not a great measure. There are plenty of things that increased my well-being for a year, jobs, relationships, etc. If any of those things had been permanent, I'd be incredibly depressed today. In response to Krasenstein, Crimea River, writes, I wrote the article, and the point is, these boys have their puberty blocked the moment it starts. That can be as young as 10 years old. So at age 10, they have to be able to consent not just to being sterilized and not just to a lifetime of being anorgasmic, but also to requiring the riskier form of vaginoplasty using a section of the colon. All that comes with early puberty suppression in male children, not in a tiny number of cases, but in the majority of cases. Do you honestly think a child can consent to such interventions? Interesting. Here's the question. Can a child consent to life-altering bodily alterations or surgeries? I'd say the answer is outright no, because these kids have not experienced life. They don't know. And so the safest bet is to allow natural development. But they don't. They don't. Elon Musk then says, I repeat my statement that any parent or doctor who do this should go to prison for life. What about lobotomies? Lobotomies. Should parents have the right to go to a doctor, an expert, who says, your son is acting out, your daughter is acting out. We should remove a section of her frontal lobe. Should parents be allowed to do that? I think the answer is no. You should not be allowed to go to a doctor and get a prescription and a recommendation for a lobotomy on a child. Sorry. You know, there are challenges in how we deal with certain issues. Is the doctor the expert? It's tough. What if a parent says, my baby should be vegan? Should the government intervene? I say the answer is yes. What if a doctor says that the child should be given sex change surgery? Should the government intervene? I say yes. The question is not the principles of when and how the government is allowed to intervene. The question is our principles and our morals. That is to say, parents should have the ultimate say within reason. I shouldn't even say ultimate. Parents have the say within reason, and to a certain degree, the government can intervene. And I hear from my libertarian friends who say, statist, Tim, you're a statist. Statism. The real question is community and shared morality. If a group of people voted in the right to, take another group of people and lock them in jail, should we allow the government to do that? No. You see what's happening in China with the Uyghur Muslims. I mean, these people mostly didn't vote this stuff in, but the government should not be allowed to do that. But just because the government does a bad thing doesn't mean that everything the government does is a bad thing. I think for the most part, what the government does are bad things. Don't get me wrong. I just think we as a community should decide some things we do not allow. Murder, for instance. Like attacking people, for instance. The government intervenes in that regard. I don't know. Where would we be? Actually, I take that back. We know where we'd be. If there was no government intervention, take a look at New York, take a look at San Francisco. When criminals are allowed to run rampant and there's no intervention and no enforcement of law, that's what you get. The bigger problem is not so much the enforcement of law, but the lack of a shared morality. So this is where I'm at. When I look at these stories, I say this. Parents should be allowed to determine that their child does not receive certain procedures. The government should intervene on certain procedures purely based on my subjective morals. End of story. Because I think of it this way. Let's say a family says my baby should be vegan. Okay, the baby's going to die, right? So that shouldn't be allowed. The government's got to stop that and make sure the kid can get proper nourishment. I agree with that. Let's say the parent says my child should not be forced to undergo a vaccination. The government should not be allowed to enforce that. Those are just my principles. Those are my morals. Those are my lines. I mean, I can break it down for you why. Babies can't be vegan. I mean, they can be, but it's like really bad for them and they need protein to grow. And the issue of vaccination is that's it's more of an opaque procedure in that, well, I'm totally for vaccines. Love them. I think they're fantastic. Brilliant technology, saving countless lives. However, parents have a harder time determining the effects, and there are side effects and there are risks. That is to say, there are known side effects like Guillain-Barré syndrome for vaccines. I get it, but a parent has a right to say, I don't think the risks are worth it. Now, as for having your baby be vegan, okay, yeah, that's just insane. Babies need to eat. Eating is a basic function. The process by which vaccines work is opaque. The sourcing of said vaccines is opaque, and it's hard for the average person to understand. So I recognize there are serious challenges here. But the problem I think we're facing is that there is a conflict of morality. The left demands the right to intervene on some grounds, but not on others, and the right has an inverted view. I side more so with the right on their view of morality. Don't sterilize kids. The left says keep the government out of it. Interesting, isn't it? Where that line is being drawn. In the end, I hope from this everyone recognizes just one simple factor here. Principles be damned. I mean, I have principles. They're rooted for the most part in understanding, truth, knowledge, etc. The right of the individual personal responsibility. And that informs my other decisions. But when it comes to matters of law and what we should and shouldn't allow, there's no hard line. You can't just say the government should never intervene. Okay, well, then you're going to get a whole bunch of crazy things happening to kids. Like if the government doesn't intervene ever, the government shouldn't mandate certain treatments. Okay, that means parents will seek out doctors who will give their kids sex changes and the government won't intervene. So you think the government should intervene and stop that and say you're not allowed to give your kid that treatment? Okay. Well, if the government can intervene and determine the proper course of medical action, then they'll force your kids to get vaccinated. Do you see the point? It's not always about what the government can and can't do. It's about what we allow and what we accept the government doing. But I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.